Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 269, and we're going to talk about Leonarda Jonie. I just was listening to a Jimmy Dore podcast. I've been kind of out of it. I haven't uploaded an episode pretty much because I think I relapsed. I couldn't get a good night's sleep again. Last night I had actually a good night's sleep, the second good night in a row. And so I'm actually becoming a human again, as they say in Korean culture. But when I get super tired, it's really hard for me to even think straight and therefore to analyze much of anything. So I thought I was going to take an easy day today, not upload an episode. But then I heard this episode on from Jimmy Dore talking to Leonarda Jonie, who was raised in the Bronx, but an Albanian section of the Bronx. And they were talking about comedy. She's the most banned female comedian. And whenever I hear a comedian getting banned, of course, it's one of my favorite subjects. And so I got to listen. And the things that she said was so compelling that I wanted to make an episode. First of all, I really like her comedy, her personality. Not that I would tell the same jokes, but I can appreciate the humor, the style, and also the subject matter that she uses. So basically, um, it got to a point where, and so basically, she was banned mostly because of the trans comedy that she would do. And she said that she had to stand up and that she couldn't deny the reality that was in front of her. Both of them, Jimmy Dore and Leonarda, they talked about cross-dressers, especially if you grew up on MASH in the 70s and 80s, then you know that Klinger was a prominent character on that show who was cross-dressing to get a Section 8, to get kicked out of the army so he wouldn't be in the war any longer. But cross-dressing is no longer even discussed. They've all become trans. It's sort of like how the flu all became cervasis during all the lockdowns and everything. And you're not allowed to have a different opinion. You must accept what you don't agree with. This is basically me summarizing what they said. My own comments and observations I'm going to at the end after I do this. And what forced her to basically come out and express her own opinion was when she was in a women's only space, uh, talking through things. Men started showing up, men who identified as women started showing up. And she was just like, wait, no, no, this is not happening. But she was forced to accept it after some time. The way I understand it is that she no longer wanted to play that game. And so she said, no, you know what? You are a man. And so she would publicly say that, which of course made her unpopular and got her banned from a lot of comedy clubs. Interestingly, she says how this led her to Christianity. Um, and she hinted that it was after reading about martyrs, how they refuse to go along with or say something they don't believe is true. In other words, to have to tell the truth, even if death is part of the punishment or the cost. And that appealed to her. And now she understands martyrdom. And I guess that somehow brought her to Christianity. She didn't specify what kind or what branch, but she is in Texas now, after all. So whatever is heavily practiced in Texas or whatever is popular down there, I guess, is where she is now. They do talk about discrimination, and Jimmy Dore was like, "Hey, so you don't discriminate against gays?" And so she's like, "Sure, why not?" And it might be misunderstood, but I think what she was saying was, and she does say this, why should anyone be excluded from discrimination? Or to put it in another way, What do you mean? Everyone has their personal preference. And I've talked about discrimination. All it is a distinction, drawing a distinction one from another. So everyone always gets discriminated. So gay versus not gay. And so obviously there's a discrimination. Now, I'm positive that when it comes to equal access or customers shopping wherever, she really doesn't care. And so I think the concept though of are you allowed to discriminate against someone who's gay or not? It's like, well, what are we talking about here? Right? So if I'm not gay, must I discriminate against someone who is gay by saying I'm not going to go on a date with you, right? And you can draw this line anywhere you want. And so discrimination happens all of the time and not necessarily exclusively only in the way that certain people would want to sensationalize it to be. Even the Christian baker who refused to bake a certain cake, I think that case is ongoing now, or maybe it was finally settled and now it was appealed again. I don't know. That's going on for years and years, all over something which was just simply a setup, right? I do believe that they were targeted for the lawsuit to be made an example of. But in real life, normal people will not wait 10 years, 5 years, 10 years to get a wedding cake. They'll just go to another baker and say, bake me my cake, because those people over there won't bake me my cake. That's how it actually happens. And so we see is a show trial of people trying to make an example of demonize, somehow shame certain groups of people. And then they talk about how hate speech is covered under free speech, right? Hate, to hate something is covered under free speech. And so Jimmy Dore pushed back on that. And she correctly said, no, hate speech, the concept is a loophole, right? And all of that hate speech rhetoric is emotionally driven. And they go down and discuss how the trans community have exploited it, right? And then how a lot of people have legislated morality to weaponize this idea of hate speech. And then it was really interesting take on how a lot of white women exploit the trans community to get out of their white privilege sort of demerits, right? The strikes that are against them for being white. I thought that was interesting. And then they talk about how feminism wrecked women, which is a very interesting discussion. I won't get into it too much. I was surprised. I didn't know that, they talked about a prominent feminist leader was a CIA, worked for the CIA. Okay, whatever. And then he talked about mentally ill people, how basically they were, all the mental institutions were defunded, and so they're out in the streets. And so everyone who was let go from mental institutions basically wound up in prisons, right? Because they were committing crimes, you know, engaged in behavior which resulted in them going to prison. And so, all it was a transfer of indirect, long, convoluted, expensive transfer from mental institutes to prison, to criminal prisons, right? And then they closed up by talking about immigration was a moral hazard. Obviously, there are different opinions that were being shared. I just wanted to let you know that that's what they discussed. Now, the whole thing that really interested me was, and I have this conversation with my wife often, that a really good comic, right? Someone who does comedy on a deeper level, right? So not just physical comedy, not just lowbrow humor, but someone who really can run with the intellectuals of our day. Comedians are really intelligent. I'm envious, I'm jealous of their intelligence. I can think so. I've said this before, right? The Dave Smiths of the world, and now this lady, Leonarda Jonie. I don't know why I keep putting a French accent to it, but I'm sorry. But anyway, but comedy as a whole, uh, it keeps people honest, right? The function of comedy is to keep people honest, right? Yeah, there are lots of other things that comedy does for society, for our state of mind, our mental health. Yeah, I get that. But comedy, especially the way that you see people, comedians getting banned, right? What are they doing? They're censoring. Why, what are they censoring? They're censoring subjectivity. They're censoring other ways of looking at this phenomena, whatever it might be. And what they are afraid of is this other subjectivity, which shows how it can be funny, how it is not as dire or emotional as a lot of people want it to be. I've talked about comedy humor. Oh, let me check what episode that was real quick. Um, Episode 61. This was a while ago. Um, but I talked about humor. Humor is, well, again, one of my favorite topics. And in that episode, I talked about the benign violation theory, which came out, which was a paper published in 2010. And they tried to explain comedy by explaining it as a benign violation theory. And I talked about how the insertion of the word benign, like it can't be hurtful, it can't be hateful, right? So they inserted benign to allow people to still control the definition of what is acceptable comedy versus unacceptable comedy. But the reality is that what is violated, expectation is violated. So when your expectation of what is supposed to happen next is violated, then it potentially becomes funny, right? And depending on your age, right, something is funny. So a baby, if you trip, a baby giggles, right? When they something happens that isn't expected, it becomes funny. Now, as we get older, we realize, oh, someone might have gotten hurt. And so you don't laugh, you rush to help first, and then maybe you'll laugh about it later. But it's the violation of the expectation, which means that there is an expectation, which is why stereotyping, racialization, race dynamics, all of this creation of a category, right? Like the trans category and all the descriptives of the trans category is really important, right? Because it creates an expectation. And so when you violate that expectation, especially if you are not one of the ones that are invested in that racialization or that expectation, and then it becomes funny. And so all of us, we have preferences, right? So we have things that we prefer to do, things that we think are better than other things, which is part of our expectation. Each of us have it. And as long as each person's opinion is respected and they're allowed to have it, then fine. When does it not, when is it not permissible to have that? When there is a law or regulation, like a hate speech law, which basically says, no, you're not allowed to see things that way anymore. In other words, you're not allowed to laugh. You're not allowed to have comedy anymore. And so Jimmy Dore himself might be guilty sometimes of making that same mistake of generalizing so-called oligarchs, right? So, and I'm sure he breaks it down. And usually when he breaks it down, I kind of like, yeah, okay, I get along with that. But with the healthcare CEO, I think there was a little bit of, from what I recall, it was a little bit problematic where it's lumped in. Like there's no addressing of the causal situation, which led to a healthcare CEO being the way that he is, right? And I've talked about that before. And so there's that always a frequent. It's an easy mistake, everyone does it until it's pointed out. But it's easy to make a generalization and a blanket statement, which assumes that every single person who can put in that category is exactly the same, and that is generally never the case. So Joni points out that she is she sees ridiculous, coerced subjectivity, and that's what bothers her, right? So she wants to show this other alternate subjectivity, which is funny, but she's not allowed to. It's you are forced to look at it from a different subjectivity, which is to see it only as serious, as important, right? There is this is not no laughing matter. This is serious. We have to save their lives. In my class, I would always say, everyone is allowed to have their subjectivity. You can't force other people to no longer use their subjectivity and use someone else's. And remember, that goes back both ways, right? Whether in this case, the trans community and someone pushing against the trans community, right? I mean, sure. Except the difference between the comedian and the trans community is that the trans community can get the comedian banned, and the comedian can only speak words, right? And there's no violence behind the words, right? Um, right? She's not physically doing anything, but we can see that there is instances of violence against people like Joni when she points out this type of phenomena. So comedy becomes hate speech, um, which therefore disallows people from pointing out hypocrisy, pointing out humor, pointing out what's ridiculous, pointing out preferences, pointing out the limitation of subjectivity, right? And that's everything that comedy does. And as soon as you make comedy, you call it hate speech. Oh, no, that's not comedy because I think it's hate speech. Well, it's censorship, right? And so what are you censoring? You're censoring the ability to point out hypocrisy, to point out this is just simply subjectivity, right? And again, to emphasize, believe what you want. You're free to believe whatever it is that you want, but you have to pay the price. You have to pay the cost of having that subjectivity. And right now, we see this level of protection for the trans community primarily because it's subsidized by the government, right, through the university, and it is protected by law. That's the only way that it has gotten to this level. Otherwise, most people probably would not really hear too much about it at all. I've said it before that all comedy is racist, of course, meaning that it's going to be offensive to someone somewhere, right? Everyone has a taboo. Everyone has a no-go topic, like a sensitive topic. Like if people talk about that, they get really upset. That is hate speech for that person. And so if you were to ban all hate speech, no one would be allowed to talk to anyone, right? No one would be able to say anything anywhere because everything is hate speech. And so if you take that away, right, and you allow all comedy, and keep in mind, I don't think there's some comedy that I just can't listen to. It's just not funny for me, but I can understand how other people hear it as funny, but also need to talk about it, primarily because they need to work through certain issues. Also, there's that comedy, morbid comedy, right? If you're around death all of the time, gallows humor, I think is what they call it, right? So you're around death all of the time, and so you can't live there, and so you need to, tell jokes just to get out of it, right? But that's hate speech, right? If you were not part of that occupation, it's hate speech. And so that's something that we should always keep in mind. So comedy, then now that we allow all comedy, comedy causes people to think, right? This is the reason why it was usually the monarchs, right, the government that would ban certain forms of comedy, right? Because you can't make fun of the government, right? It undermines their authority. And so comedy causes people to think. It challenges people to re-examine what it is that they believe. Are things really true? The things that they're saying to me, are they really true? And comedy allows us to examine it in such the casual, entertaining kind of way. You don't feel like you're being lectured to. You don't feel like you're in a classroom. And that's the appeal. That's what the beauty to me, anyway, of comedy. You can actually receive a kind of a subversive education through comedy, right? And that's I know in Korea. I've someone told me once that once one day out of the year you're allowed to make fun of the king, right? And people went crazy making fun, keeping all these jokes inside of them for a year. And then finally on this day, you can say it openly, right? And it all comes out. And then people who hear the jokes, they're like, oh, yeah, never thought of it that way. And so it brings down, it takes some of the shine off of that authoritarianism that we're living under now. Now, people who cannot laugh at certain comedy, it's because it's their truth, right? And it's their desire that everyone must believe it, right? It's not just the trans community, it's any religiously fanatical uh, community, right? Whether it's your favorite football team, your favorite athlete, and even your traditionally understood religious organization, right? You would call it heresy, right, or blasphemy to say the things that you would if it seemed to make fun of your religion, right? So if we would say, oh, that's sacrilegious, well, of course it is, right? But within the church, you can say, okay, that's sacrilegious. So none of you are allowed to say it. But people outside of church, outside of the authority of that governing body, of course, are going to say it all the time, right? What are you going to do about that? You can't do anything at all, right? So you can't disallow people who are outside of that authority, who don't give any credence to that authority. You can't force them to say anything. That goes both ways. And so if a religious group, a religious organization cannot prevent other people from saying what they consider sacrilegious, well, then the trans community, the same as well. And you should listen anyway, right? Like I'm a fanatical Jesus freak, right? But I listen to all of the comedy that's said against my religious beliefs because it's a challenge, right? If you hear the comedy and you have no answer to the comedy, or you can't say, oh, well, they don't understand it. That's why it seems like that's what it means, and that's why they say what they say. Like if you cannot explain the comedy that you're hearing, how people are perceiving yourselves, or maybe have it as a challenge of saying, oh, well, in the future, I should be more careful about that. Or even to say, oh, wow, that might be wrong. And then to re-examine things, right? To go back and re-examine. So comedy is a very, very, performs a very important function. It keeps us honest. It keeps us always self-evaluating, introspection, constant reevaluation of the things that we actually believe. Comedy can even reveal what we misunderstand, right? Not that I recommend it, but how many times when you're in a fight with your significant other, you wanted to say a joke because you realize it was a misunderstanding and you were going to crack a joke. Sometimes you can do it and it breaks the ice. Sometimes you do it and then they get even more angry, right? Or, sometimes even though they do get angry, they realize, oh, okay, yeah, it was a misunderstanding. So comedy is so important. Not only does it make us feel good, but it keeps us positive. Not just positive in laughing, but also in terms of improvement, right? And so it's a very entertaining, very positive, very constructive way of getting us to re-examine all of the things that we think are so important for us. That's it for today. Again, you know, apologize for not having done a lot of episodes, but I'm on break now, and I think my voice is on the mend. I'm able to sleep at night, so hopefully everything will be back to normal. I probably will take a day or two off for Christmas and New Year's, but otherwise, have a great week. And if I don't hear you till the next year, talk to you till the next year, have a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a wonderful New Year. Talk to you next time.